Welcome, everybody, to our Recycling is Infrastructure 2 campaign webinar. We are welcoming about 160 registrants to this webinar, and some are still coming on today at the moment. We are recording this webinar, and we will be sharing that recording as well as the slides later on. Gary will be putting in the link in the chat box, the American Recycling Infrastructure in the chat box. I would like to also note to you that we have some conferences coming up. And before we begin this webinar, the National Recycling Congress will be presented on that November 3rd and 4th, and we're taking registrations on the National Recycling Coalition website. And we're also taking registrations for the National Zero Waste Virtual Conference for December 8th and 9th. And that's registration link is also on the National Recycling Coalition website. I would like to, I'd like to introduce to you the moderator, Brenda Platt from the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, and she will introduce our speakers.
Thanks, Bob. And I'm Brenda Platt, as Bob said, Institute for Local Self-Reliance based in the Washington, D.C. area. Thanks for joining us today. And Bob Getter didn't introduce him, but he's with the National Recycling Coalition, one of the founding organizations for the Recycling is Infrastructure 2 campaign. Thank you, NRC. Thank you, Bob, for hosting this webinar today. And thanks for all of you for joining us. So today, what we're going to be focusing on is learning more about the specific types of infrastructure that would be eligible for funding if this numerous number of infrastructure bills are adopted by Congress and the president. And we're going to talk about some of the bills are going to be the Compost Act, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, INVEST, the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act, and some others. And it's each of our panelists, which are listed here: Jesse Maxwell from SWANA, Linda Norris-Walt from U.S. Composting Council, Alice Nichols-Vinuesa from World Wildlife Fund, and Kate Bailey from EcoCycler are our panelists, and they'll each present for about 10 minutes each. We'll have a minute or two for questions, and then we're going to have lots of time at the end. So, and that is Jesse Maxwell from the Solid Waste Association of North America, SWANA. And Jesse is the Advocacy and Safety Senior Manager for SWANA. He regularly tracks and reports on legislative and regulatory issues in the municipal solid waste industry. And today he is going to be talking to us about the INVEST Act and the Reconciliation Act. So Jesse, the mic is yours. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Brenda. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak with you all today. As was just mentioned, I'll be providing updates on the infrastructure and reconciliation bills. These are both major topics for the week in DC, along with minor issues like raising the debt ceiling to avoid default and preventing a government shutdown during a pandemic, just tiny things going on in DC this week. So it's really shaping up to be an eventful week on the Hill. As Brenda mentioned, I am with SWANA, the Solid Waste Association of North America. I want to let you know a little bit about that organization. We're a professional association, not a trade association. So that means that our members are individuals, not companies. And about 2/3 of our membership are public sector, with about 1/3 being the private sector. And we're happy to have members in every single state. As a professional association, we're more focused on education and research rather than advocacy per se. But for that reason, that means we're that much more valued as a resource for federal agencies, members of Congress and the press, and for people at the state level as well. So first, I'll share a little bit about the infrastructure bill and where it currently stands. That having been said, it's possible since the last time I looked at the news, things could have changed because they're currently changing by the moment in regards to this bill. Attempts have been made over the years in previous Congresses to pass a bill similar to this, but it finally seems like it's a real possibility at this point. The top line number is about $1.2 trillion, which would be the largest investment in infrastructure in over a decade. And about half of that amount represents new spending, with the rest being re-upping previous spending and programs. It does have bipartisan support, which there aren't many things that you can say that about so definitively. It previously passed the House and then passed the Senate. And in the Senate, it passed 69-30, which is a pretty impressive number again for any legislation at this point. However, because of the changes that occurred in the Senate, it has to go back to the House to be voted on again. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi announced that the plan is for this to be voted on this Thursday, the assumption being that she has the votes to pass it if she's scheduling a vote on it. However, the Progressive Caucus of the party has stated that they want the reconciliation bill, which is another bill I'm going to talk about here momentarily, to be passed first, and have made threats that they might not vote for the infrastructure bill if the reconciliation bill isn't prioritized. We'll see what happens. Negotiations again are underway, and so on Thursday we'll find out how that all turns out. But speaking of the infrastructure bill, also known as the Invest Act specifically, some of the items of interest. So the infrastructure bill includes text of the Recycle Act, which some of you may be familiar with. The Recycle Act was originally introduced in the previous Congress, but didn't pass there. SWANA supported this legislation and has been helping to shepherd it through. This legislation would include about $75 million for recycling and education outreach, which, as we know, is really important for reducing contamination and for increasing recycling rates. It also would include instructions to EPA to develop a model recycling toolkit for communities to use. So they would have this toolkit to sort of guide their programming going forward. We are happy to see that it was included in the infrastructure bill, and we're hoping that obviously it gets passed. Also of note in the infrastructure bill is money for the Save Our Seas 2.0 Act, often referred to as SOS 2.0. You may remember this bill actually passed already in 2020, but that was without the actual funding for some of the grant programs. The Save Our Seas 2.0 Act is a really extensive marine debris prevention bill that addresses the issue both domestically and internationally. And what's of note here is that it included a post-consumer materials management infrastructure grants program. This grants program provides funding to support and provide assistance to local waste management systems, and that includes municipal recycling programs. So it could be used for a wide variety of uses. The infrastructure bill finally actually provides the money necessary to put that grant program that had already been passed into action. So it would receive about $275 million should the infrastructure bill pass. So those are really two parts of the bill that I think will be of interest to this group. The second major piece of legislation Congress is considering right now is the Build Back Better plan. This is better known as the Reconciliation Act or the Reconciliation Bill. And that's just because of the method that's being used to pass this legislation, is why it's called the Reconciliation Bill. It contains a whole host of major priorities for President Biden and for the Democratic Party. $3.5 trillion is the price tag that's quoted at the moment, though it is likely that that amount will decrease after negotiations continue within the party. As I said, this is a priority for the Democrats, and it's expected that no Republican votes for this legislation will come through. So it will be on the Democrats alone to be able to pass it, which is one of the reasons why reconciliation is being used. Essentially, it's just a method that allows them to avoid a filibuster, and they just need a simple majority to pass it. One issue with using reconciliation is that there are restrictions on what can actually be included in a reconciliation bill. And so that will keep maybe certain programs, certain priorities from being included simply because they can't be passed in a reconciliation bill. The important thing here is that the margins within the Democratic Party mean that basically every vote is needed, which means that every member of the party has leverage, which means there's going to be a lot of negotiation around it. As I said, the reconciliation bill is still very much in flux and changing. The final contents will probably change drastically from what we suspect might be in it now. But one item of note that might be included, which I think we want to encourage, is a grant program for waste reduction. Includes about $750 million for that. And you can see it can be used for a wide variety of waste reduction programs. In addition to this specific grant program, there's also discussions about inclusion of obviously climate change priorities. And depending on what those are, those could have a big effect on the solid waste and recycling industry. For instance, they may address carbon tax in the reconciliation bill. And again, depending on how that's worded, if it includes methane, if it is very broad, again, could have big effects either directly or indirectly on solid waste and recycling management. Just from the business side of things, there are going to be lots of changes to corporate tax law in there as well, which is going to have an effect on the business side. Maybe not germane to this discussion, but something important when you're thinking about the industry as a whole. As I said,
Hey, Jesse, one more minute.
Absolutely, almost done. Negotiations between progressive and moderate wings of the Democratic Party are going to be shaping the bill, as I said, without Republican support. And the negotiations around the infrastructure bill are going to then influence the negotiations around this bill. So it's all going to be interrelated going forward. So as I said, it's going to be a very eventful week, and we should know more by the end, including whether the infrastructure bill is able to pass the House on Thursday. So before I take questions, I just wanted to mention Swan is going to be talking about this and more at WasteCon in Orlando, Florida, November 1st to the 4th. You can learn more about that at wastecon.org, and I hope to see many of you there. And I'm happy to take questions, Brenda.
Yeah, we have a few minutes. Thank you, Jesse. We have a few minutes now for some questions, and there's one that came in on the chat. Particularly to what you presented, Jesse, who decided on the $750 million figure? This would be spread pretty thinly across the country, wouldn't it? Would big cities be prioritized?
Yeah, so I don't have a lot of details on the behind the scenes that went into the formulation of that, choosing the $750 million. This has been an ongoing issue for us when we've been advocating for other legislation like the Recycle Act, the Recover Act, is just a lack of understanding about how much money is really necessary. I completely agree. There seems to be this misunderstanding about when you spread this money over our country, a number that sounds large is going to be very small. We've talked extensively, to the extent that we can, about the issue about how much money it actually does cost to affect real change. Unfortunately, I think the overall concern with just limiting how large these bills are is really, pushing back against our attempts to try and ask for more money. But I do think we have a good argument for it. And I agree. I think we do need to be asking for more money. We just have to explain better why that's necessary.
Right. Another question, Jesse, maybe we can squeeze this in before we move on to Linda, is there a list of other organizations that are supporting these two bills that are part of the infrastructure bill?
Yeah, sure. I can provide, there's a link on our page. I'll have to find it, and I can do that while we're talking, where I can link to supporters of the Recycle Act. In regards to the Save Our Seas, again, the bill already passed, so this is just for the money. So there isn't, there were a lot of supporters of Save Our Seas, but there's not necessarily a coalition supporting the inclusion of money for it.
Okay, great. So we'll have more time folks for more discussion and question and answer, so keep your questions coming. Meanwhile, Linda, why don't you start sharing your screen and I will introduce you. So next we have Linda Norris-Wald, who is the Director of Advocacy and Chapter Relations for the U.S. Composting Council, which is a national trade organization that advocates for the commercial composting industry and also does training and certifies both people and products and best practices of compost production. And the U.S. Composting Council has been one of the founding members of the new U.S. Composting Infrastructure Council, which the Institute for Local Self-Reliance has been a part too. So it's been really a pleasure to be working with Linda closely on the Compost Act. But today, Linda gets to talk about it. So Linda, the mic is yours.
All right, good afternoon. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for having me today. I'm so glad to be part of this Recycling as Infrastructure 2 movement with the Compost Act, because we are part of the recycling sphere. So I'm excited to be with everyone. And as Brenda mentioned, I do advocacy and government relations for U.S. Composting Council, and we are a 501c6 trade organization. So lobbying and working on this stuff is a part of our mission. We are made up of more than 800 members in all scales of commercial composting, as well as allied organizations. So a lot of what our people do, we have a large municipal presence, and a lot of what our people do is run the facilities. So getting to the Compost Act. So we began about 2 years ago, the USCC, meeting with a few key players on the Hill about getting more awareness of composting out there. And this really moved forward about, I'd say, 6 to 9 months ago, when the Compost Infrastructure Coalition formed. And that is on compostinfrastructure.com if you want to look at who the partners are. But this group came together with a mission of very diverse partners, but we all had a central mission of pushing for more infrastructure for compost facilities. So what our group began to do was to meet with various members of Congress who we thought might be likely co-sponsors of a bill for some funding of compost facilities. And we had very great luck with Congresswoman Julia Brownley of California, who actually last year was a sponsor of the Compost Act as well. It was a little bit different of an act at that time, which I'll talk about in a moment. So why do we need a Compost Act? And as you can see, it does stand for something. It's pretty clever, cultivating organic matter through the promotion of sustainable techniques. Why do we need one? Well, if you take, for example, ReFed, which is the nonprofit national organization that studies food loss and waste and works on priorities around that, they found that there are 62.5 million tons wasted, and of that, USCC does believe in reducing waste first and also sending food to food rescue, people that need it and animals that need it. So then when you get down to the compostable part, you have 13.8 million compostable tons still to take care of. So what we did as we were meeting is we kind of looked at what that meant, and that really meant that with the amount of food scrap accepted, had a lot of work to do. Depending on the size and scale of the facility, we felt like we needed between 300 and 500 more facilities accepting food waste, either adding it on to the yard waste they accept now or opening, which led to our figure of $200 million per year, or a total of $2 billion over 10 years. So originally, when this was being talked about, it would have been 10 years to 2030. Now it's to 2031, depending on what form this bill takes, which we will be talking about. So when it comes to the money, it is in two buckets. One bucket that we envisioned was grants to NGOs and governments primarily, and some private sector partnership with those. And the grants would take up 25 to 75% of the facility or project cost. And there was a $5 million grant cap. For private sector, there were loan guarantees, and those would have up to 80% project cost with a $5 million single loan. And there was also a provision in the Compost Act that does carve out 25% of that total $200 million per year for community scale composting. So what kinds of things are eligible? Anything from development of a facility, whether it's the engineering or the design or the actual pad or excavation, equipment needed to run the facility, existing facilities, if they're going to scale up, equipment that is needed for that. On-site systems, which in urban areas is oftentimes the best answer in terms of space, and also collection programs. So it was important that collection be included in this as well. So there were also priority factors that we set up within the bill, both from our own viewpoint and from that we heard from members of congressional staff. The first two are related, which are obviously we want to fill in spaces in this country where there is no food waste composting. So that is a high priority factor where they create new capacity for that. We also felt very strongly from our side of it, the coalition side, that it should follow best management practices for running of composting facilities, producing a high quality product. We did not want to end up producing a product that was not contributing to microbial activity and healthy soil, or instead just becoming a landfill cover or something of that nature. There was also a heavy emphasis on operation and participation of and by the disadvantaged businesses and people of color. That is a very high priority, and also source separated organics. So MSW composting facilities are not part of this bill. The other piece of the bill, I mentioned last year that Congresswoman Brownlee introduced a Compost Act last year that did not follow through. So this piece was kept in. This is another very important piece. As anyone in the traditional recycling community knows, you have to have markets at the other end. So the bill also adds compost use as a conservation practice, a USDA conservation practice. This began in California, where the NRCS actually adopted compost use on farms as a conservation practice. So farmers not only can get reimbursed for applications for no-till or for cover crops, but can also submit applications to be reimbursed for compost. So this act would make this nationwide. USCC has also been working this from another direction regulatorily with NRCS if this doesn't go forward. So keep top of mind, I mentioned infrastructure. Brenda actually did a study years ago about the many jobs that composting facilities provide in comparison to landfills and incinerators. Composting is a climate solution, so that's another reason we've been using to sell this. And composting reduces landfill dependency when it comes to methane production and landfills being sited traditionally in communities of color or disadvantaged communities.
2 more minutes, Linda.
All righty. So what you can do, you can look at this website, the compostinfrastructure.com website, and what you can find there is a place where you can use phone to action to fill out your name and have an email go straight to your local congressperson to show that you're supporting this act. And this is the co-sponsors that we have so far, and we're on a big mission in USCC with our chapters to try to get more co-sponsors. So we're very excited to see this growing. And what we have found through that form that you just saw is that more than 2,400 advocates have sent nearly 3,000 emails just since mid-July to the identified members we've been targeting of the House and Senate Ag committees, including House Ag Chair Stabenow, Boozman, Scott, and Ranking Member Thompson on the Senate side have received more than 2,500 emails each on this act. So get out there and take action. You can also on the same website share social media. And as far as what you can do, learn from us at the U.S. Composting Council. If you haven't heard of us, we actually have a new membership called Compost Advocate, where for if you're not in the industry, but you simply want to advocate as an environmentalist or other supporter, you can sign up for $75, and we provide you with advocacy tools to help us advocate for compost nationwide. He's having one, so it sounds like we've got one lined up for every month between Zero Waste and Swana and us. We are in January in Austin, Texas. So I thank you very much for your time. I hope that you will help us with the Compost Act and all these other pieces of legislation we're talking about today.
Thanks, Linda. Awesome. We have one question in the chat, which I'll direct to you, but just a reminder to folks, please don't use the chat for the questions. Put your questions in the Q&A box. But here's the question. Are there safeguards in the Compost Act to ensure PFAS does not go through compost into the food supply? The presence of PFAS and microplastics in compost is a significant concern being studied by the EPA.
That's very true. And this specific is focused on compost use and compost infrastructure. So we did not include that in there. We are actually, through our foundation, hoping to do some research that is much needed about levels of PFAS in compost that are tolerable. But it is an issue of great concern that is not introduced or is not addressed in this act.
Yeah, and I can just add that the act was very clear, as Linda already mentioned, in not including mixed composting, and being very clear it's only for compostable materials that the funding would go to, and following best management practices. So I think in a way, kind of not indirectly, but it's being addressed that way. There's another question, Linda. Let me just have you answer this one quickly, and then we'll move on to our next speaker, Alex. Can you provide clarification on whether MSW compost infrastructure is included in this bill? That seems problematic when a number of cities need such infrastructure to assist in moving on from incinerators and landfills.
I think that if I'm understanding the question right, I think we've already said this is source separated organics only, so it is not included.
Yeah, and if the implication is that you need MSW compost in order to move away from incinerators and landfills, I will just take off my moderator's head for a second and say that I would debate that. I think mixed waste composting is a last resort before incineration and landfilling, and that the priority needs to be on building infrastructure for clean organics and clean compost, so that we have a healthy soil amendment that's free of those microplastics and other chemical or physical contaminants. So we can debate more about that in the Q&A, so keep the questions coming. And with that, Alex, why don't you start screen sharing and I will introduce you. So Alex Nichols-Vinueswa is with the World Wildlife Fund and supports their U.S. food waste team's portfolio, which includes working with policymakers and the ag, grocery, retail, hospitality, and food service sectors. And recently in that role, he's helped to lead a coalition of environmental NGOs to develop a policy action plan for Congress and the administration to reduce U.S. food loss and waste by 50% by 2030. So today he's going to talk about the Zero Food Waste Act. So Alex, the mic is yours.
Thanks, Brenda. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. Again, my name is Alex from World Wildlife Fund, and I help lead our food waste work here in the U.S. And we're part of a larger freshwater and food team focused on meeting both the needs of people and nature to create a more sustainable, equitable, and circular food system. So like Brenda said, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Zero Food Waste Act and the opportunity before us to help give communities the resources they need to build their food waste recycling infrastructure and to keep food out of the trash. For some quick background, I think many of you know this, but around 40% of all food is lost or wasted in the US. And as you're likely aware, organic waste is the number one item entering into our landfills by volume, where it's like, we've heard already, it produces methane. And food loss and waste is now responsible for more greenhouse gas emissions in the entire US airline industry, just to put that in context. Obviously, to help address this, we've set our national target, which aligns with UN SDG 12.3, and the interagency mission between the FDA, USDA, and EPA started under the Obama administration, has been continued under the Trump administration and then onward. At the start of the year, to Brenda's point, we came together, several of the NGOs listed here on the screen, to create a food loss and waste action plan that really outlined the top food loss and waste opportunities and priorities for Congress and the incoming administration to accelerate progress against this national goal and to really meet it, to reduce food loss and waste 50% by 2030, as well as achieve our climate objectives, especially those methane emissions, again, as they become such a key priority for the administration following the recent United Nations report, which stated that cutting methane emissions is one of the most cost-effective and critical pathways for us to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. And then it's important to note here that there are already several dozen states and municipalities taking action to measure, separate, and reduce food waste in their communities, whether that's specifically focused on food waste or zero waste focus. But I mean, as you've already heard, there are huge swaths of the country where there are just really no option other than sending food waste to landfills or incinerators. So I think the key here is that the solution should be context-based, meaning that what's good for one community might not be good for another. And the measurement and local context should really guide these decisions on what is the most appropriate food waste infrastructure. And that's the approach we've taken. With that in mind, we've structured a plan around the following priorities. The top one was really what led to the Zero Food Waste Act, which was to give the EPA grants for municipalities, native nations, and states to measure, prevent, and recycle their food waste in their communities. And we've additionally outlined strategies to increase food donation, leverage food loss and waste to meet U.S. climate objectives, educate and empower consumers to reduce food loss and waste, and standardize date labeling. And since releasing our plan, just note that 60 leading companies, NGOs, and municipalities have signed on, which you can read about at foodwasteactionplan.org. However, again, that first recommendation, which is what we're here to discuss, that caught the attention also of Representative Julia Brownlee's office, who along with Representatives Annie Kuster, Chelly Pingree, and then Senator Booker introduced the Zero Food Waste Act earlier this summer. And the act really consists of three components, which would again be administered by the EPA. And it would provide municipalities, native nations, and states with planning grants, which could be starting to offering composting services, for instance, and studying the necessary infrastructure and setting up the staffing to do so. And then this could be measurement grants, which would be regularly reporting on food waste to identify hotspots and then build the appropriate programs or infrastructure to deal with that. And then finally, food waste reduction grants, which is very much about putting the actual hard physical infrastructure in, which could be food rescue or composting, let's say. It's worth noting that we've worked hand in hand with the Compost Act and that coalition. And because we offer, again, this measurement focus and this policy planning focus, in addition to the infrastructure piece, we really see ourselves as complementing the work that they're doing. In addition to building support and co-sponsorship for the Zero Food Waste Act in the House and the Senate, we are supporting congressional champions to make food waste a priority in the reconciliation package. So in the House, the Energy and Commerce Committee has adopted elements of the Zero Food Waste Act via provision to provide grants to communities to reduce waste, which is including food waste. We continue to push for similar language to be included in the Senate via the EPW committee in particular. And it's just been great to see as a latest update, the House Ag Committee also adopt components of the Compost Act as well, which is, again, very complementary to the Zero Food Waste Act and part of the overall kind of suite of reforms we see needing to be addressed to reduce food loss and waste. So really looking ahead, this reconciliation push, I'll just note too, is just kind of one part of the overall policy landscape on this issue that we outlined in our action plan. And we're really looking forward to partnering with the administration, agencies, and other members of Congress on food waste reduction and additional legislative efforts to help the country meet its national goal. We'd love everyone's support, telling Congress that it's time to end food waste and to really support the Zero Food Waste Act. We have a link that I'll share here in a minute in the chat where you can also send a letter directly to your local representatives and senators. We're specifically, just to stress, looking to build support in the Senate. And so I will just say that in closing, I think we all know this, but just to stress, I mean, food is just too valuable to throw away. And we're hoping that this act can really support local, state governments, native nations to develop a more circular economy, invest in community health and jobs, and curb, obviously, our climate emissions. So I wanted to say thank you, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thanks, Alex. And you may have already addressed this, but we have a few minutes for some questions for you. So I don't see any coming in the chat or the Q&A. So, but perhaps you can address what needs to happen from here for the Zero Food Waste Act to have a chance of being successful.
Yeah, I think, like I said, in particular on the Senate, there's some encouraging signs. We're focusing our efforts there. Last week, EPW's Chairman Carper held a hearing on the circular economy where the importance of reducing food loss and waste was highlighted. And Senator Booker, obviously one of the original sponsors, continues to help champion the issue. We've also just continued to kind of, like many of you are doing, we're just continuing to really try to build support. We've had many of our action plan and Zero Food Waste Act supporters reaching out to really stress the importance of ensuring we seize the moment to give community support they need to keep food out of the trash. So I think it's really just about continuing to make that outreach, which again, I've listed on the screen.
Yeah, awesome. And we did put the link in the chat for folks to the foodactionplan.org. So Alex, check that. If there's another link that's better, go ahead. Oh, Alex, you already put that in. You're already one step ahead of me. Awesome. All right. So let's move to our last speaker, Kate. Kate, while you're sharing your screen, I will introduce you. And Kate.
Brenda, could
Yes.
I interrupt a second? In the chat, there's been some discussion about MSW that's getting really confused, and I just want to step in for a second to explain. MSW is referring usually to municipal solid waste. In the presentation, they were talking about mixed waste. They sound similar, but they're very different concepts. So I just want to make sure everyone understands. MSW, the acts will fund programs that are addressing municipal projects, but they're not addressing mixed waste projects.
Yeah, thanks, Gary, for that clarification. And yeah, I mean, the funding is to address municipal solid waste, but we're trying to direct, at least in the Compost Act, in the context of this question, is direct the funding to highest and best use. So we want source separated organics from that municipal solid waste, not mixed waste or mixed municipal solid waste. Okay, so let's move on to Kate. Kate Bailey is the Policy and Research Director for EcoCycle, which is a nonprofit in Boulder, Colorado. It's one of the largest recycling nonprofits in the world, and it's been around for 45 years. Congratulations, Kate. And I've had the pleasure of working with Kate on a number of projects. And fun fact, EcoCycle was the very first recycling operation I ever saw in person back in 1989. I think when you were still collecting curbside with school buses. So it's been fun to watch your EcoCycle's trajectory and arc over the years. But EcoCycle is a member of the Break Free from Plastic movement and has acted as technical content experts for that movement, particularly on recycling. And Kate has worked on this bill, Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. So Kate, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thanks so much for the introduction, Brenda, and for the great panel. I just want to stop and acknowledge that it is such an exciting time to be working on recycling policy. I've been in recycling for almost 20 years, and I think we have more bills now than I've seen cumulatively over those nearly 20 years. So kudos to a lot of the great work that folks have been doing for such a long time, and just super exciting to see all this momentum moving forward. So with that, I'm going to dive in and talk about the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. And I'm going to start first by talking about the Break Free from Plastic movement. So I am privileged to be able to represent the movement today on the webinar, and just wanted to give a shout out to the over 2,000 organizations that make up this global movement, envisioning a future free of plastic pollution. And I think what the Break Free from Plastic movement some of the power behind it is really addressing plastic pollution from a life cycle perspective, working on all aspects of extraction, pollution, disposal, and really uniting under common values of environmental protection and social justice. So really is a power-packed group of folks. I feel like just having an image on the screen is not giving enough credit to really the immense change that groups around the world are making on this front, including the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act, which was introduced in 2020 and was reintroduced again in 2021. Thanks to Senator Merkley and Rep. Lowenthal. Huge kudos to them for leading this effort. It now has 110 co-sponsors in the House and 12 co-sponsors in the Senate, so it continues to gain traction as it moves forward. So we're going to jump in and talk about some of the specifics of the bill. The bill itself is quite large and quite comprehensive. In fact, it is the most comprehensive piece of plastics legislation Congress has ever taken up. Again, treating everything from extraction to use to disposal. So really, very broad sweeping legislation. So before we jump into the details, I kind of wanted to take that 30,000 foot level view and really talk about, there's three main goals of the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. The first is reducing plastic production at the beginning. Second is increasing recycling rates. And then third is protecting frontline and fence line communities. And so really those three buckets, again, working across that entire life cycle of plastics is really the core of the bill. Within that, there's a lot going on within the bill. So I'm just going to quickly touch on a couple core components and happy to take more questions on other things later. But in terms of recycling and recycling infrastructure, I want to focus on a couple key provisions. The bill does establish a national producer responsibility organization and policy that would require producers to pay for the recycling of their packaging. It does also create a national deposit recovery system or national bottle bill. It would be 10 cents per container to fund the take back of beverage containers to improve recycling. The bill does ban several types of single-use plastics, including plastic bags and also little shampoo bottles and things of the like. It bans the export of plastic waste to just out of the country. So it's really focused on domestic infrastructure. There is funding for reuse and refill grant programs. There's a lot of provisions around environmental justice. There are reviews required of chemical recycling and other plastic production facilities to understand what those impacts are upon the frontline and the fence line communities so we can better regulate. There are standards around recycling labeling, composting labeling. There's also efforts to reduce the amount of toxics in packaging. And then the last thing I'll mention is there's also a minimum recycled content standard, which is very aggressive. I believe it's 80% recycled content in beverage containers by 2030. So that's a lot of bill in a quick nutshell. It really is a pretty comprehensive piece of legislation. And wanted to just, again, focus, I know we're talking about infrastructure today, so wanted to really call out the pieces of the bill that are more infrastructure focused. The first is the grants for reuse and refill product pilots. So really emphasizing that we need to move beyond just plastics recycling, that we need to focus on reduce and reuse more. So establishing pilots and funding in a number of different spaces for that. The extended producer responsibility and the deposit return system policies will definitely unlock a lot of funding and investments in recycling and composting. And there's specific language about how much investment, not dollars, but in terms of percentage earmarked to those funds. It will also have an impact on plastic production facilities by having, I believe it's a 3-year temporary moratorium to study more the impacts of these facilities, and environmental justice review on processing facilities that I think is something we can also be leveraging in other bills as well. Next step on the bill is really to continue to grow support. It has a lot more co-sponsors than it did last year, so it's definitely gaining in popularity. But another key component is really breaking apart the bill and using it as a model for both state initiatives as well as for other national bills to incorporate different parts of the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. So for example, part of the act now has prohibits the discharge of plastic pellets into wastewater, and that is being taken up by Senator Durbin, I believe, in Illinois as another act. There is also a soon-to-be-released national bottle bill that will be spun out of this legislation that's being crafted right now. So that would obviously have a huge impact on recycling and reuse infrastructure across the US. So as is probably typical with very big pieces of legislation like this, we're seeing the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act really as a landmark. This is something where we would like to have all of these different pieces put in place, but not necessarily going to end up all in one bill, but how can we take the working components and integrate those into other legislation at both the state and the national level. So definitely expect to see a lot more movement with this similar language being adopted into other bills as makes sense. So that is the quick overview on Break Free from Plastics Pollution. Look forward to some questions, and absolutely please go check out the website, Break Free from Plastics Movement. They are a really power-packed group of organizations, great allies for all of these bills that we're talking about on today's panel. And please show your support, get your senators and representatives behind the Break Free from Plastic Act.
Thanks, Kate. Well, why don't you leave that up just for another second, so people have your contact. I'm gonna give you a few questions, and then we'll stop sharing your screen and we'll get to see all the panels. So folks, just in case you're wondering, we did schedule an hour and a half for this webinar. So we have, it's only 13 more minutes to the top of the hour, but we really have close to 45. So keep your questions coming. All right, so first question for you, Kate, is, are compostable single-use plastics banned? And maybe you could just, that was the question that was typed, but maybe you can expand on how the bill in general addresses compostable plastics.
The bill does ban a few types of single-use plastics. It's not very many. It's pretty much plastic bags. It's the little hotel beverage containers, and I'll have to look back at my notes once I stop screen sharing to remember the other one or two. So it's not a very broad sweeping per se. And to be honest, I'll have to check on how single-use plastic is defined. I don't think it applies to compostable plastics in that space, but I'll have to double check on that.
Okay, and you can stop screen sharing now if you want. I'm gonna ask you a few more questions though, Kate. How many, and folks, other panelists, you can think about this too, because I'll ask you this too, but how many co-sponsors, do you know how many co-sponsors are on this bill, and what has been the process for adding to the number of co-sponsors?
Yes, there are 117 House co-sponsors and 12 Senate co-sponsors, so quite a few. Not enough, but quite a few. So I am not deeply engaged with the political process behind this, so I highly encourage folks to reach out to the Break Free from Plastic Pollution movement, Break Free from Plastic movement, to get involved, and tons of great resources on sharing this with your representatives and legislators and keeping them informed on it.
Great. Can you just speak to, is the Break Free from Plastic movement working on policy at other levels aside from this national bill?
Yes, great question. So Break Free really being a global movement, there's a lot of action happening at the local, the state, the national, and the global level. So a big push is a global plastics treaty, which people may have heard of, similar to the Paris Climate Agreement. Similar, can we get a global agreement on plastics? Break Free has also been very strong on the Basel Convention and pushing the US to sign on and pledge to no longer export plastic waste to developing countries. And then within the Break Free movement, there's tons of organizations like EcoCycle that are working on local and national recycling policy. A lot of the great policy initiatives coming out of California around recycling labeling, minimum recycled content standards, things like that have a broad support of coalition members under the Break Free movement.
Great. One bill that has been discussed is a 20-cent fee on virgin plastic, the Reduce Act. Can you talk about how that would affect recycling infrastructure?
Yes, that bill introduced by Senator Whitehouse and now has a Republican version as well, is potentially being introduced into the Reconciliation Act. So Jesse may be able to add a little bit more on there, but the bill would put a fee on the production of virgin plastics. So it would be 10 cents a pound for virgin plastics over time, and then that funding would be earmarked for investments in waste reduction, recycling infrastructure, and other ways of managing plastics pollution. So, a lot of us have talked for a long time about removing the subsidies on fossil fuels that make plastics artificially cheap. This bill is looking at, essentially adding a fee to make virgin plastic more expensive and to help recycled plastics be able to compete better in the marketplace, and also to drive investment in recycling and waste reduction infrastructure. So it is a fast-moving bill. Like I said, it's potentially going to be involved with the Reconciliation Act. You may have seen ads in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal from the American Chemistry Council calling this a plastics grocery tax. So they are coming out very strong against it, which tells me that the bill probably has a good amount of potential if they're concerned with it moving forward. I do think it would be a great step forward in order to help recycled plastics compete more with the very low cost of virgin plastic. And so encourage people to check it out. It's called the Reduce Act from Senator Whitehouse.
So let's have all the panelists turn their videos cams on. So Jesse, Linda, Alex, and I hope I didn't miss anybody. And Jesse, I don't know, Kate said you might want to say something about the Reduce Act, so don't have to, but if you want to, I don't know if you know anything about that.
No, I can just second that there are discussions about its inclusion in the reconciliation bill, but since so much of that bill is still up in the air, not sure what its likelihood is for inclusion, but yes, I've also heard that it's being discussed as being part of that.
Okay, great. So just a few housekeeping things I'll just mention. There's been some questions about whether this presentation slides will be emailed to attendees afterwards. The answer is yes. You will get PDFs of the slide decks as well as a link to the recording. And I want to do a shout out to Jill Danello at Green Education, who's providing all the tech support and outreach and actually hosting the Zoom call. So Jill, thank you. There was a question about whether we'll be able to save the chat and all the links there. I don't know if you want to respond in the chat or unmute and say a few words. It's fine.
Yes, in the email, we'll be sending out the salient information from the chat, the various links that have been discussed, a link to the presentation slide decks, a link to the recording, and that information is also available on the ILSR website, which we can share a link to that in the chat as well.
Great. Thanks, Jill. Thanks for hosting. All right. So I asked, Kate already addressed this, but if we could, I'm going to go back through the reverse order of how you presented, just to talk about, one, how many co-sponsors and what has been the process for adding the number of co-sponsors? And then I'm going to ask Kate, maybe you can address this too first. This other second part is, if there's a zero waste organization or another organization that wants to send supportive letters, is there still a window for that? You know, what's the process? What do you recommend? So Kate, let's just start with you on the last. If somebody wants to send in a letter of support, are you taking that, or is it really just go to this website and sign on here?
Yes, letters of support are very much needed and appreciated. I will drop a link into the chat with the website with a pre-formatted letter you can send to your representative or legislator. Break Free from Plastic Movement also has some great social media posts and also some videos, particularly on the connection between plastic production and the environmental justice impacts of communities living near those facilities. So it'd be great to share any of all that information with your networks.
All right, thanks, Kate. Alex, I'm sorry, I apologize if you already talked about how many co-sponsors, but maybe you could just recap that and what's been the process to adding to the number of co-sponsors.
Yeah, it's been through that direct outreach, both through our supporter network. I believe, don't quote me on this yet, I'll pull it up, but we've got about 8 sponsors in the House, and then we have 2 in the Senate right now. So I can share those details here in the chat. But I mean, if your organization is willing to reach out directly, that's great. Otherwise, we also have, like I mentioned in the link, a way for you to simply, like, very quickly create a letter and send it to your local representative.
All right, awesome. All right, Linda.
Yes. So
co-sponsors, process, and then signing on letters.
Right. We have 14 co-sponsors in the House and 1 in the Senate. We've really, actually, the House bill, we were made aware of it earlier, so we were working hard on that through our chapters. We have 13 chapters where we've been meeting with, I'd say, about 12 members of Congress so far. And we actually have a few states that are not chapters that there's been, like, if I get 5 to 6 people, I get them going. We have a list of how you reach out if you want to have meetings too. So they've been Zoom meetings. They've been pretty productive. And then also you can go on the Compost Infrastructure website and sign on to the Take Action link, which I'm putting in the chat right now, if you want to individually or as a group sign on. And then there is also a group sign on letter. If you want to send me an email, I can put you in touch with how to do that.
Great. Jesse, co-sponsors, process, and letters of support.
Sure. So in regards to the items that are being included in the infrastructure bill, it's really just a matter of whether the infrastructure bill gets passed or not. So we're not really doing any active advocacy work at this point. We did the advocacy to get them included. So there's not really any action there. On the reconciliation bill, SWANA isn't doing advocacy on any specific portions of it at the moment. It probably will depend on what we determine or what we see actually gets in there. But the Recycle Act, I can give you the background on that. As I said, it was introduced in Congress last session by Senator Rob Portman of Ohio, and it had in this session, when it was reintroduced, 9 other co-sponsors, bipartisan co-sponsors, who supported the Recycle Act. So I think that bipartisan support is one of the reasons it was able to be included in the infrastructure bill, including the convenient fact that Senator Portman was one of the leads on putting together the infrastructure bill as well.
Yeah, and it's great that you have that bipartisan support, Jesse. I think for the Compost Act, we have yet to get bipartisan support. So maybe, Linda, getting those names from Jesse on the Infrastructure Act, maybe they might be willing to co-sponsor the Compost Act. I don't know, Jesse, what you think about that, and I don't know. Yeah, and Kate and Alex, maybe you could just weigh in a little bit on, has it been a struggle to get bipartisan support? I mean, it seems like everybody would be in favor of reducing food loss, and Kate, I don't know about plastics, if there's bipartisan support, but Alex, why don't Linda, first, why don't you respond on the Compost Act? Is there anything on the bipartisan issue you want to
So, yeah, so
Okay.
among those meetings that we've had, 2 have been with Republicans so far. And actually one, I heard that he is ready to co-sponsor. And what a lot of the Democrats have told us is they're looking for Republicans to sponsor, and we'll have a lot more, I think, jumping on. So Jesse, I will be in touch with you. But, I think sometimes in our community, which I think you're all in, we really push on the climate reasons and those kind of reasons. And we have to remember that there's economic development at stake here too. And I think we are working on crafting some bigger messaging on economic development.
Alex, anything on the bipartisan nature?
Not officially to say, that they've been co-sponsoring, but we have, like Linda said, we've had a lot of conversations and a lot of interest. I mean, food waste as a general issue is not hard to get behind. It's a matter of introducing efficiency into our food system and our supply chains at the same time that it's about reducing that environmental impact and addressing food insecurity. So it's not a hard issue. It's just, I think, and Jesse did a really good job of speaking to this. There's just with reconciliation in particular, and our bill part of that, it just makes it difficult given right now how things are stacking up on that side. So we're continuing to try to build support, but nothing I can officially state just yet.
Kate, anything on the bipartisan issue here?
I will say that certainly the Breakthrough from Plastic Pollution Act has its fair share of critics. There was a number of provisions, such as the moratorium on new plastic production facilities, that were pretty immediately a non-starter for a lot of industry folks and Republican support. But I will say that, acts like the Save Our Seas have had pretty strong bipartisan support, and certainly the issue of plastic pollution cleanup is a very bipartisan issue. So to the extent that we're talking about, release the prohibiting the discharge of plastic pellets into our wastewater, that's an issue that's more widely supported than some of the other components. We're also seeing there is support for recycling labeling, which is something that's in the bill. That's something everyone wants to see, as well as better education standards. And so, there are components. It is, a very comprehensive piece of legislation. So there's easy to pick holes in a lot of the individual parts, but there is some bipartisan support for some of those elements as well.
That's great. And in fact, there was a question that came in on the chat just kind of on this, and you addressed parts of it. I just want to give you an opportunity to expound on this. But are there parts of the plastics bill that are most or least palatable to moderate/conservative members?
Yeah, definitely the moratorium on plastics production. I mean, that's a pretty bold step forward. And, I think in many ways meant to drive the conversation about the impacts these facilities are having. There's also been a lot of contention within the recycling industry about the National Extended Producer Responsibility Bill, as well as the National Bottle Deposit System. There's lots of devils in the details on those types of legislations. And I think, again, this bill was helpful in raising the awareness about those solutions at a national level. And certainly as we're seeing EPR conversations accelerate at the state level, this is part of the solution of just sort of driving that conversation forward.
Yeah, follow-up question that came in on the chat. RE, the plastics industry opposition to moratorium on virgin production, is the EPR part of the bill that will give the industry control over plastics recycling? Is that a trade-off for accepting the moratorium?
I would say no. I don't think the plastics industry wants to pay a fee on their packaging under EPR. I don't think they want to negotiate that at all. I think they're coming to the realization that EPR is real. We now have 2 states that have adopted policies and many more lining up. So I think that is a rapidly changing space. But no, the EPR program was not meant to be any sort of a negotiation on the moratorium or anything like that.
All right. So here's another, and keep the questions coming, guys. We still have dozens of you on this call. Is there any, and I'm going to start with you, Jesse. We're going to go at the top of the order here. Is there any interest in Congress in adopting funding sources to invest in waste reduction, reuse, recycling, composting? this is, sorry for the long-winded question here, that were included in the American Recycling Infrastructure Plan. Example, the $20 per ton fee on landfills and incinerators. So is there any interest in Congress in adopting funding sources to invest in these, like the $20 per ton fee, and eliminating subsidies for wasting, such as the oil depletion allowance? This might help with getting Republican support. Any thoughts on that, Jesse?
Yeah, so I mentioned in my presentation in regards to the reconciliation bill that there was one grant program that was put forward on the House side already, which was a waste reduction funding program, I believe with $750 million. Could be used for a variety of waste reduction. It lists a variety of potential options there in the legislative text, but that includes programs that could, raise costs for landfill disposal and those types of activities as well. But the oil and gas side of things, I'm not aware of any. Although that is going to be dealt with in some respect, I'm just not sure of the detailed information about that yet.
All right.
Could I just
ahead,
interject? I think the question is about the a lot of the infrastructure funding is coming out of the general fund of the and in Congress, the Republicans have said let's fund these with some fees. And not the tax changes that were proposed by the Biden administration. So the question is, if we brought our own funding to fund these infrastructures, like a $20 per ton fee on landfills and incinerators all over the country, to fund the $16 billion in the American Recycling Infrastructure Plan proposals, or the $17 billion in the Recycling Partnership proposals, or the $2 billion in the Compost Act. If we brought our own funding to the table, would that help in these discussions? And has that been raised in the discussions in Congress? Sources of funding for the infrastructure investment by the U.S. into state and local governments and private industry.
So SWANA has not had any, or I have not had any discussions about any fees for landfills or incineration being used as the basis for that funding. The discussions I've had haven't really dealt on the idea of fees being the source of it, but I'm sure for some of the proposals that has been discussed, but not that I'm familiar with my own discussions.
How about the other panelists?
I can chime in and say not as a funding source, but as part of the strategy, again, in those planning grants of putting in place policies that disincentivize the continued use of landfills, since it's right now the most cost-effective way. And so if you want, let's say, businesses to start, diverting from a landfill or incinerator, you have to change those incentives. So at the same time that you're building the infrastructure, you have to disincentivize, and there's a number of ways to do that we talk about in the bill, but not as a funding source, to answer your direct question.
From the Compost Act, also, that has not been part of our discussions. It probably should be in some way going forward, considering the lack of enthusiasm we've had so far on the other side of the aisle. I will say that we mainly worked at state level up until now, so we're relatively new in introducing these concepts, but we have been studying, and I know Brenda has been as well, but the USCC has been studying, and a white paper's coming out about sources of funding for compost programs and compost infrastructure at the state level, grant programs that come from landfill surcharges. So we want to get a really good handle on how state advocates can push for that. And then one other quick thing to mention too that's interesting on EPR is we have been opposing EPR, some of the EPR bills that have been out there, not so much on the concept itself, but because that often the fee and the tax has been put on compostable products, but all of the funding has not been coming to compost infrastructure. And we feel that that's another source of funding, that if those bills are going to pass, it should be coming to composting as well as other programs.
And I'll just weigh in on the Reduce Act. That is the strategy there by passing a fee on virgin plastic that allocates funding to invest in recycling and waste reduction infrastructure. So it is absolutely bringing that funding source to the table, similar to what a landfill tax or fee would do as well. We did pass a $2 landfill surcharge here in Colorado a couple of years ago. That's going to create over $100 million within 10 years for grant funding. So Linda, happy to connect about that as a model. But Gary, that's the only one I'm aware of in terms of something that's able to actually raise funding and then, disseminate out from there.
Kate, let me just ask Kate a follow-up question on the deposit return systems, the 10 cents. Can you just, because that's a funding, at the state level, and all deposit systems on the state level vary by state. Sometimes the unredeemed deposits goes back into the industry coffers. Sometimes state government gets to keep them to build recycling infrastructure. Could you just talk about, for the deposits return scheme in the national bill, how does that, funding help support the infrastructure, if at all, and who gets to retain unredeemed deposits?
Yeah, I'll have to go. I've got my 116-page bill document on my other screen. So let me check that one and come back on that question.
All right, we'll come back to you, Gary.
While you're looking that up, just to clarify, the American Recycling Infrastructure Plan that this campaign developed with the leadership from National Recycling Coalition, and the link is in the chat, included a number of sources of funds to fund this infrastructure. So we're bringing those to the table. I'm thrilled the Reduce Act has embraced that, Kate. That was really great to hear. Some of the other things besides the $20 a ton fee on landfills and incinerators were fees on hard to recycle and toxic products, like you're suggesting with the Reduce Act, eliminating subsidies for wasting, like the oil depletion allowance, looking at EPR programs for hard to recycle items. And on the $20 per ton, that number was the low part of the range of what happened in Europe when the 1999 landfill directive was adopted by the European Union to phase organics out of landfills. Each of the nations in Europe adopted different levels of fees on the order of $20 to $40 per ton in order to fund the infrastructure needed to implement that phase out of organics from landfills. And the European Commission in recent years, in response to COVID, has adopted similar types of funding initiatives for grants for infrastructure in Europe. So there are precedents for that, and that's why we're raising those numbers in the American Recycling Infrastructure Plan. Did that give you enough time, Kate, to look that up?
We'll give you a few more, a little bit more time. We have some time. But what came up, and I think, Linda, thanks for bringing this up, is that there are efforts at the state level. So this kind of, I think it's, let me ask all of you, and I'll start with you, Linda, that the national path is not the only way to get more funding for infrastructure for all these things. So should similar efforts be pursued at the state level? And we know with waste surcharges, the example that Gary gave, that a number of states are already, creating some state grant programs for recycling and composting. And sometimes those funds go into other environmental funds as well. I think, is it Ohio that a little bit of the money, it's not much, but 25 cents on the ton goes to soil conservation districts. So, Linda,
Yeah.
is there, what should be pursued at the state level?
Yeah, it's hard to say which is more painful, to work for years to get something at the national level or to work through 50 states. I don't know. We could each weigh in on that, but that's traditionally the way that it has worked with USCC and composting. Well, and maybe with recycling and waste in general, because states and localities have control of their landfills and their waste budgets in most locations. So it has always made sense to work that way. We'll continue to try to work it from both sides and see which one makes the finish line first.
Alex, I'm going out of order here. Alex, do you have anything that you're working on at the state level, or is your focus with
Yeah.
this coalition all national?
No, we continue to work with individual states. The big one is the Pacific Coast states. They're part of a coalition, the Pacific Coast Food Waste Commitment, where they've all passed their corresponding legislation or objectives, and then we're then helping them to meet those by building partnerships between the public and private sector. I agree, though. I think the more that you can get it to happen at a federal level, but then give that, again, local guidance, like I was mentioning in my presentation, so that it fits the local context and the needs based on the measurement. That's the approach that we're taking. It needs to be a larger acceleration at the federal level, but that it's then executed or implemented with those local considerations.
Yeah. Can you just talk a little bit more about this specific coalition? Like what are the specific components of that state legislation?
Well, in California, obviously that's the most advanced of the three with SB 1383. And so the large commercial food waste generators have to start measuring and reducing their food waste. And so the idea is that you're providing technical assistance through this public-private partnership to make sure that measurement and reporting is standardized and done through best practice, but that there is also real reductions taking place and that best practices are being shared as kind of a pre-competitive basis across retailers, manufacturers, and then soon to be the hotel and food service industry.
And Jesse, what's happening from your side on state level, infrastructure activity, funding for building?
Right. And I'll echo Linda and Alex as well. The challenge here is that so much of the waste and recycling world is built at the state and local level. So then when you try and do something at the federal level, you're trying to balance, doing something that will work for all of these different systems with their slight differences and their preferences and that sort of thing. And that's certainly been one of the most challenging things we've had to do when we've been pushing at the federal level. That, along with also just educating people at the federal level. Simple fact of the matter is a lot of members of Congress and their staff didn't know how a lot of these things work because they're so often a state or a local issue. For SWANA, our chapters take the lead on state advocacy, with some of them being very active and some of them purposefully not doing advocacy at all at the state level. But we're continuing to see a lot more happening at the state level. And so we're trying to get our chapters to be more involved. I think a good example of this is the Oregon chapter and their work surrounding EPR there. I think EPR and bottle bills are going to be the two issues that at least SWANA state chapters are going to be engaging with the most, in the coming sessions in the states, especially now that we've seen Oregon and Maine sort of take the first steps.
Well, that's a good segue to you, Kate. EPR coming up again.
Yes. So I will say that in terms of the funding conversation, I feel like that focus really has been on EPR as the policy that will help bring some needed funding for recycling collections, transportation, processing, really helping take that onus off of the local governments and the ratepayers. So we're seeing a lot of traction at the state level in terms of that funding conversation on EPR, especially in Colorado as well. And I did want to circle back on the bottle deposit system under the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. The unredeemed deposits are earmarked to go specifically back into infrastructure investments in collection, education, and recycling, collection, and reuse infrastructure investments. So they're not into any type of a general fund. They are earmarked directly back into those program support, basically.
All right, great. And a follow-up to the EPR, I think you mentioned there's been plenty of critics on the bill. And as Kate probably knows, the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, we have done a lot of work. Shout out to my colleague, Neil Seldman, who's been leading this on EPR, looking at the state level and in Canada, the programs, and really, looking at the difference between EPR programs where local government, whether it's the province or the states, retain control of the materials versus giving the control up to the original equipment manufacturers. So this is not an EPR webinar. Hopefully we'll have another opportunity to go through some of those issues and have a robust debate on them. But I wanted to give Kate, you an opportunity to, respond to that if you want to in the chat about the trade-off between the moratorium on virgin production versus giving the industry control over the plastic recycling. And of course you said, no, it's not a trade-off. We're not negotiating on that. And then the question is, why pass legislation that gives so much authority to industry? So I don't know if you want to give a quick response to that or punt on it for now.
No, I'll take that one on. The EPR space is, wow, rapidly evolving. I feel like just the policy acceleration in recycling the past 2 years has been tremendous, and I think there's a lot more to come. I'm seeing the conversation in particularly evolve more quickly now that Oregon and Maine have actually put some bills out there, and so there's some pretty strong industry opposition to the Maine bill, in particular, that there's not enough industry influence on the Maine bill. So I think now that there's some legislation out there, people are starting to line up a little bit more with, what are workable solutions so that give both government and producers the right role at the table. And what we're seeing is models developing out of Oregon and out of New York that have an advisory council that is both supporting the state agency and the producer responsibility organization, and trying to find that Goldilocks space in between not giving the producers all the control and not having the state government run the program either. So lots of nuance. We can talk about EPR certainly for 90 minutes, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, and Jesse just posted in the chat that SWANO's going to be holding a webinar and how EPR came to Maine and Oregon on November 23rd, and there's a link there, so check that out. Another question that I'll start with you, Kate, but I think others for sure. Let's have everybody address this. Apropos of bringing our own funding, has the concept of taxing organizations that create used plastic or unrecyclable packaging or products and tax credits for repair, reuse, recycling, composting organizations' activities made it into any of these bills? So again, taxing organizations that create this unrecyclable, the problem materials, or tax credits for doing the right thing. Has that made it into any of these bills? So Kate, we'll just go quickly back through. So Kate, I think you've already talked a little bit about the virgin plastics fees. So I don't know if there's anything more to add.
I would just add that the California ballot initiative around the 1 cent fee on plastics and packaging would probably be the best focus for that. And then in terms of tax credits or reductions, I haven't seen any of that conversation at the national level, but I know many of us have tax credits in our states for recycling infrastructure, investments in reuse, and that type of thing.
Alex, anything in the policy work? No? Okay. Linda?
Not so much in the policy work, but I will say that there is a momentum building for a national or multi-state labeling bill for compostable packaging. And, so far it's more you get a fee, you get a fine if you don't do it right. And that may be a source of funding.
Yeah. Jesse, anything on taxing bad and tax credits to good?
Yeah, indirectly in the reconciliation bill, there is discussion about addressing a carbon tax, which would affect oil and gas industry, and obviously then, down the line affect the production of new plastics. So it's not specifically on that, but would potentially, have a financial influence on the production of those materials. Tax credit side, I'm not familiar.
Okay.
Sure, everything's on the table, it seems like. So I'm sure someone somewhere has talked about something.
Yeah. Are there, and we'll go back through around, and then if any of you have any, you can think about this. We have 6 more minutes. Any closing remarks or closing thoughts? Just offer you to to state any of those, but can you talk about other ways reuse and waste reduction policies are advancing at the local and state level? So again, more on the reuse and source reduction aspect of things. So Jesse, just starting with you, is there other ways at the local and state levels, again, not federal level right now?
Yeah, I know there's a lot of discussion about it, but I don't follow the state level activity as much. So unfortunately, I don't have examples to be able to pull from at the moment.
Fair enough. Linda, anything you want to say about?
I'll just say that I'm seeing a lot of movement on food waste in climate action plans at the county level and composting.
And Alex,
Yeah.
this is your
Yeah.
wheelhouse, right?
Yeah, we're running, like I said, through the PCFWC, we're running pilot projects that focus on prevention, focus on reduction. But when you're talking about policies, I want to plug Natural Resources Defense Council. They have a very good toolkit that provides cities with a set of proven strategies or a kind of research-backed strategies that they can implement on the food waste front. So I can ping that here in the chat to get
Great. All right, Kate. We use waste reduction, local and state.
I feel like, so in the conversations that I've been having about plastics recycling and setting targets, brands and industries coming to the table agreeing on recycling targets, but they are reluctant to agree on reuse targets. I think this is where we need to continue to push in all of these bills, that there is some sort of quantifiable reduction target in there. I don't want to miss that opportunity. I want to give a shout out to Upstream, which has been doing some great work out of California and nationally on reduce and reuse policies. I'll drop in the chat. They've got a great link on their website about several actions local and state governments can take on reuse policies, such as requiring reusable food service, their opt-out of utensils campaign, how to use procurement to drive better reuse. So there's a lot of exciting work happening out of their efforts out there.
Awesome. So I'm going to go back through again, Kate, Alex, Linda, and Jesse. Kate, any closing remarks or parting thoughts on anything? Anything I missed?
Just that, the time is ripe. I mean, I think we're all super excited about how much momentum there is. I think, we want to move forward at the local, state, and the national level. All of these issues are critical. They're coming to a head, and I think we want to be cognizant of just not wasting the opportunity that is in front of us. What we need to make some big steps forward, and we're building off the plastics pollution crisis. We're building off China National Sword. We're building off environmental justice issues. I mean, there's just so much coming together in this movement. So I just hope we can capitalize on it.
Awesome. Alex?
Just that it's a no-brainer. This is not a hard issue to get behind. And we're, obviously pushing hard on this reconciliation side, but it's going to be part of a larger landscape, whether it's in schools or date labeling, or, there's many opportunities that we look forward to partnering with everyone on moving forward here on this issue.
Linda?
I agree with everyone else. And I'll just say that when President Biden made his first State of the Union speech, he mentioned cover cropping and no-till, and I want him to also mention compost. That's when we'll know we made an impact.
Jesse?
Again, I agree with what's been said, but I'd also just encourage people to continue to be involved in events like this and to be involved with many of the different organizations that are working in this space. What I found is, although you may have a specific area that you're particularly passionate about, by working with others who are in the similar, type of advocacy work, you're going to find yourself with a lot more opportunities and making a lot of connections that if you just stay in your little silo, you're never going to make. So, get out there and make more friends, basically.
Yeah, here. That's all spot on. And I'll just say, recycling, composting, waste reduction, avoiding food loss, it's creating jobs, it's protecting the climate, it's building healthy communities, and so much more. So this is our time. So contact your elected officials, local, state, and national, and have them co-sponsor these bills, take action, and support the reconciliation instructions for recycling and composting and everything that's before them. So with that, I want to again thank Bob Geddert at NRC for hosting, sponsoring this event today, and also to Jill Danello at Green Education. Bob, do you have anything you want to say?
Just
closing?
thank you, Brenda, for moderating. Thank you, Jill, for hosting this, and thank you all the participants for being a part of this webinar. Thank you all the presenters. Wonderful webinar.
All right. Have a good day, everybody. Bye-bye.